Okay, well, Professor Halamish, thank you very much for introduction, and thank you very much for having me, although at a distance. I must also apologize because due to the delay here, I will not be probably able to stay until the end of the session for discussion, and I apologize profusely, but simply the session being delayed, it would, let's say, overlap with my another meeting. So without further delay, let me start my brief talk here. Now, the title of the talk is "Poor Poles Look at Warsaw Jews and at the Warsaw Ghetto." Now, the title is, of course, a sort of tie and addition to a very famous essay from 1987. Written by Jan Błoński, which was sort of a breakthrough essay in Polish thinking about Polish-Jewish relations. And itself, it was a let's say invocation of Miłosz's poem "Poor Christian Looks at the Ghetto." So to put the thing in the right perspective, I chose. Wasn't difficult, by the way. I chose diaries which have been written in Warsaw or by people who lived briefly in Warsaw, but who were in Warsaw at the time, by non-Jews, by Poles, who left this kind of documentary evidence. Now, why diaries are so important, I don't have to explain to anyone here. This is one of the most crucial primary sources that we have, usually unfiltered through the, let's say, experience of the time, and giving us, especially the diaries, which have been written without any kind of afterthought to it being published. So sometimes what we find in diaries will be in this case, in certain opposition to what you heard in the previous session from Dr. Persson, but much rides on whether you look at later testimonies, memoirs, or do you look at diaries which basically deliver the unprocessed impression or little processed impressions of the time. Now, when I wrote the article actually in Polish several years ago about these Polish impressions of Jews, Warsaw Jews in Warsaw Ghetto, I was struck how poor Polish memory, if I can say so, was when compared to the Jewish memory. I mean, all of you are familiar with Ringelblum's archive, number of extraordinary diaries, and then we have extra volumes of Jewish diaries written in hiding. I mean, for the Jews, as you all know, this was a time of unprecedented horror. They were witnessing the death of their own nation. For the Poles, it was a time of horror, but it was not a time of existential threat to the entire nation, and this is reflected also by the weight of this documentary evidence. So, in terms of Polish Warsaw, non-Jewish Polish Warsaw diaries, the pickings are surprisingly small. Now, starting a few words, I don't have much time with the Jewish memory, which is abundant. I would suggest we have three in Warsaw. We have three periods of Jewish memory in Jewish accounts, which can be which overlap, but they can be delineated in a way. One is the early period of occupation, 39, I would say, to the end of 1941, which is the period when Jewish diarists have much hope. If you look at Ringelblum, at Levin, if you look at Cup 1, you can see that during these first 2 years of occupation, before the ghettoization and during the early ghetto period, there is much hope in terms of Polish-Jewish relations, that now these two nations, these two peoples will find each other because they should be united in the face of the common, deadly, dangerous enemy. And this is quite visible in these Jewish diaries. Now, first, let's say, it's a really sign of caution, and Professor Dreyfus wrote very diligently about this phenomenon, and these stumbling blocks on the way of Jewish perceptions of the Aryans' society outside the walls was related, for instance, to the so-called fur action, when the Jews had to surrender furs, and the ghetto was filled with traders from the Polish side who used this opportunity to basically take advantage of the Jewish misery. And then, of course, a second period is when hesitation sets in. And the third period, the greatest shock, is once the ghetto is being liquidated, and the Jews have to, some of them flee to the Aryan side, and they encounter a society transformed. And this is what I will talk about today. Moving to the Polish diaries, I had about 10 of these diaries, half of them unpublished, which I dug out in the archives. One of them has been in the meantime published as a book, and a very important one, Weleżyńska's. Others, one I published myself, but most of these things are still in the archives as manuscripts. Which one day perhaps should be published. So, what's the general impression of this Polish memory of their Jewish co-citizens? Well, first of all, it is that Jews are of little importance to the authors of these diaries. Now, I am not here saying how representative these diaries are, because we have so few of these diaries. Most of them are members of Polish intelligentsia. I will tell you a few words about them in a little moment. So what you can see throughout these Warsaw-based diaries is that Jews exist really on the horizon, distant horizon, on the margin. Now, the Jews come into the focus whenever Jewish fate is somehow impacting the Polish fate. So in other words, when it starts to burn, let's say, and consequences for the Polish society can be dire, then of course the spotlight is on the Jews, and wave of interest is quite visible. Now, so what you have basically at the Polish diarists in Warsaw are concerned with own suffering, with the mass arrests conducted by the Germans, with problems of being forced to go for forced labor in Germany, and then German reprisals, especially after 1943. So the Jews are, as I mentioned, at this very large distance. Generally speaking, this Polish memory of the Holocaust in these diaries here is very, very poor. It seems as if this Jewish catastrophe occurred really outside the Polish experience. And sometimes one is surprised how this horrifying tragedy and catastrophe, how little direct impact it had on the authors, as I mentioned, members of Warsaw intelligentsia. To give an example, from end of 1940, there is an unpublished diary of Adam Chętnik, known Polish ethnographer, who writes, and I'm translating on the fly here. So the Jews had to move to the ghetto, and soon all the stores and shops were transferred into the Polish hands. So in Warsaw, we are not meeting many Jews, and some people say that it would be even hard to adjust again to their presence. Now, the Franciszek Wyszyński, who was a retired engineer, a person of humble means, notes on the 31st of December 1941, he says that disapprovingly. He says that there was a lot of smuggling going on from the ghetto and to the ghetto. You could bribe your way, you could basically bribe Polish and German guards, and you could deliver to the ghetto and take out of the ghetto whatever you wanted. Now, he writes in December 41, this boil has been cut. And as I heard, 11 Polish policemen have been executed. It was not true, by the way, but this is what he noted. The role of gossip is a different story. Second thing that registers in this early period in practically all of these Warsaw memoirs is the so-called Easter pogrom in April of 1940, when it was before the ghetto has been sealed, and already you have this pogrom activity, and this is reported by practically all of these diarists as a chaos in the city and as anti-Semitic elements taking over. Now, the second part is the period of the ghetto, and from November 1940 until the Gross Action Warsaw, or the Great Liquidation, and what happens here is that one of the authors, Aurelia Weleżyńska, an important Polish writer, feminist, filled with empathy to the Jews. One has to say that her diary, which has been published recently, she died, by the way, she was killed during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. Her diary brings a lot of empathy and horror at what the Jews experience. And the Polish diarists start to note that something strange occurs in the East. The news of the massacres of Einsatzgruppen starts to trickle to Warsaw. And then in the spring of 1942, when the Germans are preparing for the Endlosung, Wyszyński, for instance, notes on 19th of April, one day after the Kommunistenaktion, the shooting of hostages in Warsaw Ghetto, he says, I heard today that Germans liquidated a large number of Jews in Warsaw, according to one source 500, according to another 1,000. Well, in reality, it was about 50 people who were killed, but the diarists were noting what they could. Now, these mass executions are noted by all of these diarists. Now, so this is the third period, but these comments regarding the Jews, as I mentioned, are few and far between. The real interest explodes during the Gross Action, during the liquidation of the ghetto, and it is surprising how these diarists, most of them in any case, note their impressions. I am here translating on the fly from Polish here. That's Wyszyński, who notes on the 22nd of July. So the moment the Gross Action, the liquidation action begins, he writes, from behind the walls, one could hear lamentation and whining of the Jews. What's going on? We don't know. But some people saw that the Germans were driving towards the railway tracks, an unending crowd of Jews, old people, women and children. We are being told that they are delivered to Bełżec. So Bełżec is already something that these diarists are familiar with, but already on the 23rd of July, so one day later, Wyszyński notes, we hear that the Jews are delivered to Małkinia, and later they are being herded afoot. Where to, we don't know yet. You can see how quick is this circuit of information within the Polish community extramuros, so on the Aryan side. Now, on the 25th of July, Wyszyński, who is actually quite a vicious anti-Semite, it is quite obvious. He notes, 25th of July, where do they take the Jews? We don't know. Some people say that to Polesie. Polesie is an area far, far to the east. The Germans take upon themselves a grave sin. But after the war, writes Wyszyński, the power of Jewry in our country in a large degree shall be broken and our lives will be easier. This kind of comment actually returns on many occasions. All of this is being done during the liquidation. Surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, all of these diarists, including the very full of empathy, Aurelia Weleżyńska, note as initial impression from the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto, the death of a very well-known Polish surgeon, Dr. Rasheja, who was actually at the eve of the liquidation. He was in the ghetto operating upon a very wealthy
Professor Grabowski,
yes.
we have 5 more minutes.
5 minutes. I will do it on the fly. So they report about the death of the surgeon who was shot by the Germans who started liquidation action, and he unfortunately found himself inside the ghetto. So this is something that has been commented upon. Another news is that the Jewish catastrophe, the liquidation of 350,000 Jews in Warsaw. Wyszyński writes, well, the fundamental news is that on the stock market, the shares and gold are now falling. The prices are falling. The Jews are selling all they have because they need the money. They need cash. And also, 2 of these diarists write about Jewish front or Jewish-German conflict. So once again, it is something external to this community which they feel is theirs. So now, already by August 5th of August, Wyszyński notes that Blinka and gas chambers. This is a common knowledge among the Poles outside the ghetto, probably delivered by the railway workers. And of course, the major preoccupation of these Polish authors is that, and practically all of them repeated, what happens now to the Jews might easily next day happen to us. Now, the thing is that, as Stanisław Strałkowski, professor of biology, notes in his diary, on 23rd of September 42, just after the end of Grossaktion, everybody says that the Germans are preparing for our intelligentsia the same fate they have prepared for the Jews. Now, but there is no conclusion or no reflection of this following such a statement. Sobolewski, a wealthy landowner, a doctor also, who visits Warsaw actually he visit Warsaw after the liquidation, and he writes, horrible is the fate of the Jews, but one should openly say that they deserved it rightly, because of them millions of people died in Russia. That's the Judeo Commune, of course, canard. And then the Polish diarists are reflecting upon the especially during the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. That's the other part, uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. I don't have the time to comment upon it, but actually the major preoccupation is, what if our city will be destroyed? Or the Germans will burn down the ghetto, but this is downtown Warsaw. We need these apartments. So the kind of very, I would say, pragmatic thinking sets in. So the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto is this second point and last point, actually, when this major interest is being expressed, but also driven by self-interest. For instance, my public transportation. I cannot get to work because, you have fighting here. Once again, German-Jewish front, it's called, and it has opened, and there are no tramways going from north side of the city to the southern part of the city. You have to use special not public transportation, but special lorries, which would deliver people around the ghetto. So these are the kinds of comments, and also this belief and surprise. The Jews are fighting. How come the Jews are fighting? Certainly there must be communist saboteurs among them, or perhaps, as they 2 of them write, we hear that there are some Jews who fled from the Wehrmacht who are now with the Jews, mobilizing them for action. And also the noise during the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. We can't sleep. There is the constant firing, explosions from the ghetto. And the final period after the liquidation of the uprising is the Judenjagd. Once again, Germans are in a frenzy looking for Jews. Once again, they are entering Polish apartments. So some of these the diarists are upset because, once again, German police came to look for the Jews. They didn't find, so they were very nice and polite, but still, they woke us up. And to conclude here, so these diaries that are in this article, all practically I could lay my hands on. There is one Krachelska diary, which I did not include. I didn't know it at the time. It wouldn't change much. All of these diaries reflect one thing: deep chasm, abyss, I would say, which divides the two solitudes, the Jews and the Poles. For these diarists, Jews are beyond any kind of social solidarity. That's quite certain. They are not co-citizens. So what you see is that the alienation and the processes which have been so visible before the war, they only dramatically increased under occupation. We don't have much studies about this, but this is something which really deserves attention, that this period of occupation was a period where something shifted further, something collapsed. So this chasm, the abyss dividing both communities, became endless. And this is something that these diaries are a testimony of. So here I think, and I invite you to read the article where these examples are ample. And so with this, I would like to conclude and thank you very much for your attention.